Hello YouTube. Today we're going to take a look at the game that I would like to call Slaying the Dragon or Not. This is actually a very famous game that's been gone over by multiple strong players over time. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to add to that a little bit today. I'm going to be talking about some of the mistakes that Fischer made in his analysis that maybe other commentators haven't mentioned on. And I'm going to talk about whether or not Fischer really slayed this dragon. So, of course, Fischer, greatest chess player of all time, bar none. This came out of his book, My 60 Memorable Games, which was by far and away the greatest chess book ever written. I absolutely recommend it to everybody. You should read this book if you want to get better at chess. One of the things this book does is it shows you what Fischer was thinking while he was playing. Basically what Fischer does is he gives you kind of a blow-by-blow of what was going on in his mind, what his internal mental conversations were during the game, and I just can't imagine anything more valuable than that. And even his mistakes, the mistakes that he makes in his games, and he did make some mistakes in his games. He has three of his losses are in his book, My 60 Memorable Games. I don't know any other player that really did that, put their own losses in their book. But his mistakes are instructive, and even his mistakes in analysis, some of which we're going to go over here, I think those are instructive too, because I think it's important to understand, I believe, the reason that he made some of those analytical mistakes. I try to understand his thought process and why he made these mistakes. So this was Fischer, Larsen, Interzonal, 1958. It's game 2 in My 60 Memorable Games. So let's get started. So the game starts out e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, bishop e3. And now here Fischer points out, quite accurately, he points out if the black were to play knight g4 here, the move bishop to b5 check is simply advantage white. So black did not do that. He instead played bishop g7, and then we have f3, castles, queen d2, knight c6, and then bishop c4. And again, Fischer makes another comment here. Bishop c4 at the time, back in the 1960s, actually, well, back in 1958 when this move was played, this move was relatively new. Up until then, people had mostly just castled queenside on this move and just tried to get that attack going as rapidly as possible. And of course, people still play castles queenside today, but largely because of this game, the move bishop c4 is taken over. And the idea behind bishop c4 is really simple. It just simply prevents the move pawn to d5. And okay, so back then, they didn't have as many tools for dealing with this move. Today, the main line is bishop d7 and rook c8. And then an alternative main line is bishop d7, queen a5, and rook fc8. And those are basically the two main lines. Back then, they played this move, the knight takes d4. And this move is actually, you can still play this move today. It's not as popular, but there's really nothing wrong with it. This move didn't really fully slay this variation. This game shouldn't have ended it, but it is a lot less popular, I think, largely due to this game. So knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and then bishop e6. And now we have bishop b3, and then queen a5. And, okay, so here's where I start kind of looking at Fischer's little, just analytical tidbits, just the things that he kind of chose to ignore. Queen a5 is a super logical move, and he didn't really comment on it at all. But if you look at the game, what Larsen ended up doing was he played b5, b4, and then he played queen b5, and he played a5, a4. So it seems like the queen on a5, although it's clearly just put there to support the move pawn to b5, it does seem to just kind of be in the way. So one thing that I don't think a lot of other people have commented on, and it's not a hugely popular move either, but it really should be if you're serious about playing this position, is just simply the move, instead of queen a5, queen d7. You're not in the way of any of your pawns if you play the move queen d7. And this move isn't very popular, but the handful of people that have played it have been very strong players. So they definitely understand that they don't want to waste that tempo putting that queen on a5 and then later having to shuffle that queen to b5. Instead, they would like to just be able to play b5 and a5 all in one go. So for example, like castles queenside b5, and then you can see that we're just playing a5 unimpeded here. And this is much quicker. And that's really the name of the game in the Dragon, is how quickly can you attack the queen side versus how quickly can you attack the king side. So I would recommend, if you're going to play this variation, I would recommend the move queen d7 as opposed to the move queen a5. So after bishop b3, the game continued queen a5. castles queenside, and then of course we have b5. And Fischer again rightly points out another great piece of information to know is if instead black had played bishop b3 after c captures b3, it's actually very difficult for black to break through on the queen side with his pawns, and that's important to know. So he points out white's attack usually just lands first. Okay, so instead of that we have king b1, b4, knight b5. That knight goes down in the middle of the board, just plops itself down. And then we have bishop takes d5 here, which is the best move. And then Fischer points out that knight takes d5 is not very good. And it's not very good for a reason you might not think of. It's not actually because the dark square bishops come off the board, although they do. The real reason it's not very good is because you end up having problems along the e-file. So for example, after bishop takes g7, king g7, e takes d5, bishop d7, rook on d to e1, and we're putting a lot of pressure on the e7 square. And this is actually kind of what we call a Marco hop formation, and this doesn't just occur in the dragon. This can occur in pretty much any Sicilian, where the knight goes to d5 and then the pawn transfers from e4 to d5. This is why in just about any Sicilian, the main point of contention is going to be that d5 square. And if white can dominate that d5 square or put a piece on it and force a recapture, he can start gaining some serious pressure down that e-file, and he can have a permanent advantage there. So this is actually a problem in pretty much all Sicilians, including the dragon. So bishop takes d5 is the absolute correct move, and then Fischer replies with bishop takes d5. And then Fischer here again, he points out that Larsen made a mistake here, where Larsen should have captured this bishop right away. And unlike in the previous position, we don't actually get a problem down the e-file because there's actually kind of tactical issues. So one example would be like, let's say we have knight takes d5, bishop g7, getting off those bishops, and then this in-between move is really critical. Black can play the move knight to c3 check. And then it actually doesn't matter so much how we recapture. We could recapture with the pawn. We could play b captures c3. And then the move rook a b8 is really powerful here. We're just getting a huge attack against the king. And then after c takes b4, queen b4, queen b4, rook b4, bishop b2, we just bring the other rook over, get our piece back. And actually I would argue black's even better here. I don't think this is equal. I think this is just better for black. Black has the initiative, and the initiative is something. So the other way, of course, we could play it is after knight c3 check, we could play bishop takes c3. This doesn't seem much better. We play b takes c3, queen c3, b c3, and then simply rook f c8, hitting these weak pawns. And again, I think, okay, maybe objectively here, maybe the position's a little more equal. We have a 4-rook endgame. It's probably going to be a draw. But again, black has the initiative. So I would say black is probably better here as well. So he points out in his own book that Larsen had this opportunity to play knight takes d5. And Larsen, unfortunately, he failed to play knight takes d5. He played rook ac8. And then Fischer brings this bishop back. He just snaps it right back to b3, and he doesn't give Larsen a second chance to take it off. And then Fischer makes a comment here, and I'm going to read it straight from Fischer's book, My 60 Memorable Games, because I don't want to get this quote wrong. Because it was, I think, a very important quote in chess history. It reverberated, I think, kind of throughout time. Because what it did was it taught everybody what the plan was supposed to be in the dragon, in the Yugoslav variation for white. And it told us how to execute that plan in really simple terms. And I think that's a really valuable thing. And I think this is probably one of the more valuable quotes that I learned from Fischer. And I think it's one of the most quoted. So after bishop b3, he gives an exclamation mark here. He says, and I quote, "He won't get a second chance to snap off the bishop. Now I felt the game was in the bag if I didn't botch it. I'd won dozens of Skittles games in analogous positions, and I had it down to a science. Pry open the H-file, sack, sack, mate." And that basically gives you the plan. He's going to pry open that H-file, sack, sack, mate. That's his plan. And he follows through with that plan for the most part in the game, and it works out really well. So let's take a look at what happened from here. So rook c7, h4. So he's starting with his game plan. We're going to pry open that h-file. So we have queen b5. Remember I discussed this loss of tempo earlier. So we have queen b5, and then after queen b5, we have the move h5, continuing the assault. And then we have rook fc8. And now we have h takes g6, h takes g6, g4, again, just continuing the assault. And his plan is basically to play g5, get this knight to move, and then he's going to exchange off dark squared bishops. And then once dark squared bishops come off the board, this position is going to be very, very difficult for black to defend. So now the game continues a5. Larsen's doing his kingside thing, his queenside thing, just continuing the attack. And Fischer continues with his kingside thing, g5, knight h5. And then Fischer plays rook takes h5, which he gives himself a very big exclamation mark. He says rook takes h5, exclam. And this is where Fischer's analysis, I think, begins to get a little questionable. And I think the reason Fischer's analysis starts getting a little questionable is, I think it's almost kind of fair. Because I think the reason his analysis gets kind of questionable is, I think in his mind, I think he already thought the game was kind of over. Black's position is just going to open up, and the squares around the black king are weak, so he kind of felt like every variation here was probably just winning for white. And I think his focus was more on what he considered the main lines or the main areas of resistance for black, where black tried to at least keep his dark squared bishop on the board, and that way he would at least have some defense of his dark squares. And I think this was first and foremost in Fischer's mind. And I think that's important to realize, as Fischer was focusing most of his analytical energy, which was immense, on variations that kept dark squared bishops on the board. And he didn't really consider that Larsen would try to do anything else. And I think in a practical game, considering this is the first time this has ever been seen, I think that was a really good decision. Because it's unlikely that Larsen will want the dark squared bishops to disappear either. He's probably well aware that he needs to defend his dark squares to try to survive. But I think this leads to quite a few analytical errors, because I don't think Fischer was deeply considering variations where dark squared bishops disappeared. And so we start with the very first one. He mentions the move bishop takes d4 as possible. But what he doesn't mention is after, for example, queen takes d4, g takes e5, g6, Fischer, again, really only considered, I think, the move queen to e5 here. And that's a problem, because queen e5 is not really the best move. I mean, it makes sense, you're covering the dark squares, but it's not really the best move. The best move here is probably the move rook to c4. And that would probably be the best move. After the move rook c4, it's actually kind of hard for white to continue the attack in a really meaningful way. And I think this move rook c4 was completely overlooked by Fischer. And I think there was a reason it was completely overlooked. I think it was just overlooked because he just didn't put a ton of energy into this line. He figured dark squared bishops were off the board here. This just had to be good for white, and I don't think he looked at it much deeper than that, or felt like he needed to look at it much deeper than that. So that was one little analytical kind of tidbit. The game didn't continue that way anyway. The game continued g takes h5, and then Fischer plays g6, which is just great for his tactical chances here. And then after g6, Larsen plays the move e5. And then we have another kind of very curious analytical mistake here, because Fischer does analyze alternatives here. The main alternative that he analyzes, and again, I think he was focused on the main line. I think he was focused on what happened in the game. e5 covers the dark squares. It prevents the trade of bishops. This was Fischer's primary objective, and this was what he was going to focus his analysis on. The alternative to e5 really is the move e6, which is basically just covering the light squares. But of course, this does allow the exchange of dark squared bishops. And again, I think this is why Fischer kind of dismissed it. So Fischer gave a lot of lines here. He gave, g takes f7, and then he pointed out if rook takes f7, bishop e6 is just simply winning for white. Can't agree more. This would be totally winning. So after g takes f7, king takes f7, we're looking at the variation bishop g7, king g7. And at this point, I think Fischer's mind kind of, in a way, it almost turned off, because he figured, okay, look at this king, it's toast. This is just over. So I think he just looked at the first line that looked good, and he just said, well, this must just be winning because there's no way that the king can defend itself with nothing around it. I mean, all the dark squares are weak. All the squares around the king really are weak. So I think he just looked at the most straightforward continuation, which is just how Fischer thought. He looked at rook g1, king h7, and then just queen g2, just threatening mate right away. And actually, for starters, queen g2 isn't the best move here. But then the reply that he puts in is kind of the only reply for black, also isn't remotely the best move, the move queen e5. But again, we can learn from his mistakes, because Fischer's line of thinking is pretty simple. It's the dark squares are weak, I have to put my queen on a dark square, nothing else makes sense. I just lost my dark squared bishop, I have to replace the bishop on this diagonal. A better move here would have just been queen e8, and that would have been a much better defensive move. But then queen e5, and then Fischer says, okay, well, I would just continue queen g6 check, king h8, and then here, again, he makes another move that's highly questionable. He suggests the move rook g5, and this is not just questionable, this is just probably an outright mistake. White's still winning here after king h8. Like, if white were to simply continue with the move bishop captures e6 here, you know, just this move, bishop captures e6. If white continues with that, then at that point, let's just take a look at it on the board. After bishop takes e6, at that point there's just no defense. You don't have moves like rook takes c2, because after rook takes c2, you would have the move, say, queen h6 would just simply be checkmate. So you don't have that option available to you. And there's precious little other options available to you. It seems like everything here is just going to work for white. So bishop takes e6 was the absolute best move. What Fischer recommended was rook g5. Now, I'm of the belief Fischer was the greatest player of all time. So I honestly think that if Fischer got to this position in the game, he would have immediately seen that bishop e6 was winning and rook g5 was a lemon, because he was just that good. He was a very good calculator. So if he'd gotten to this position, I don't believe for a second that he would have actually botched it. I think he would have followed through. I think this was just an analytical mistake that he made because he was more focused on the positions he considered more relevant. So we have rook g5, and then we have the move rook g7, and now we have a huge analytical mistake. Rook h5, and then the only move that Fischer considered was rook g7, king g8, where he was going to play bishop e6 check, king f8, rook f5, king e7, rook f7. And he thought white was winning here, and I agree. White's winning here. The problem is rook takes h5 is horrible. After rook g7, rook takes h5. Take a moment and see if you can find the move. Okay. So the winning move here for black, or the move that would definitely make it very hard for white to win, is just simply the sacrifice queen takes h5. And this is just kind of a beginner thing. You have to look at all your checks and all your captures and all your threats in every position. And I think even an amateur might have found this move. More importantly, I think an amateur would have found this move quicker, maybe than Fischer, because I don't think Fischer was looking at this line very deeply. And after queen takes h5, you pretty much have to capture back, and then the move rook h7, and now we're threatening mate back here on the back rank, and there's no check with your queen because the d-pawn is covering it. So you would have to sacrifice your queen here. So queen takes h7, king h7, and then you can take this pawn, and white can just kind of scramble, try to hold on for a draw, but that's certainly not slaying the dragon anymore. You're just kind of struggling, trying to keep that draw now. Okay, so fortunately, none of this happened in the game. In the game, Larsen played e5, and he was just trying to keep the bishops on the board. But this ended up being really easy for Fischer to get a huge advantage. He took on f7, king f8, bishop e3, then kind of d5 out of desperation, just trying to block up that bishop. E takes d5, rook f7, and there's no serious improvements here for Larsen at this point. d6 both hits the dark squares, hits the rook f6, and then bishop g5, and this is just total death. White is just hitting all the squares. He's hitting the light squares, dark squares. The king just has no safety whatsoever. And then Fischer, again, he points out a mistake that he made in a few moves here. After Larsen tries to defend with queen b7, bishop f6, d7, rook d8, Fischer points out that he actually made the second best move. He played the move queen d6 check, which did win. Larsen resigned after queen d6 check. But he points out that the move queen h6 made it faster. And if you don't see it here, I'll show you real quick. after the move queen f6, let's say we block with the move bishop g7. There it is. You've got queen going to d6, and that's going to be mate. So after bishop g7, we have queen g6, queen to d6, and that would have been checkmate, and that would have ended the game quicker. So even Fischer pointed out that mistake again. So what do we learn from this game? Well, we learned, number one, that Fischer was human. Fischer made mistakes. His analysis wasn't perfect, and he made mistakes during the game, and he was fully willing to admit those mistakes in his analysis after the fact. And he was even fully willing to admit his analytical mistakes if they were pointed out after the fact. Fischer was the greatest player of all time. And when it comes to the question of, okay, did Fischer slay the dragon, or didn't he? I would argue, yes. Not only did he slay this dragon, he taught us all how to slay the dragon. He taught us what the plan was. He taught us what moves to make. He taught us how to analyze, and he taught us how to think. So I would argue, slaying the dragon or not, I think Fischer did. So I hope that this game helps your chess, and I hope you learned something new about chess and about this game that you didn't know before. Thank you very much for watching.